a little reminder that we are sharing knowledge about how AI can be used for the best, for the worst, and how to integrate that into real applied solutions. Sarah is coming to us today. I would like to ask everyone, as usual, to do their self-introduction, because I really am terrible at bios and introductions, even though I always ask everybody to send me their short bio. So if you could please, Sarah, introduce yourself, and I've made you co-host, so you can get ready to start sharing your presentation as I continue blabbing away here shortly while you get your presentation ready.
Before we do that, Valentine, can I just quickly introduce,
Sure.
especially for those who weren't here this morning, just introduce our experts and just set the tone.
For sure.
So, you know, I don't have enough time to go into the rich experience, expertise, and accomplishments of the experts here before you, but I'll quickly introduce them. So obviously, Valentine is one of them, and you know, she brings an important perspective because whereas the three remaining experts have more experience in the for-profit, maybe with the exception of Deepti, Valentine, of course, is a lot more knowledgeable about the non-profit space, which I think from our from Alo Solutions, we'll see is an important perspective to bring. Deepti, who's again, for those of you who weren't here this morning, she's a mathematician by training. She's an AI practitioner. So I was very happy when she said that she could join us, as she really gets her hands dirty and is familiar with the very technical sides of AI, as well as bringing the business perspective to the table. She is now the director of data science at Potluck, and affiliated with SciGo, and her prior to that was working in a public institution to help SMEs and help them integrate AI into their businesses. Mike, who wasn't here this morning, thanks for joining us, Mike. He's head of strategy at Strategy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I can vouch for Mike. I've worked with him for 2.5 years, and I can vouch that he's uber passionate about helping organizations create value with AI. And he's been leading the customer success team there for some time at Strategy AI. And I think he's seen all sorts of challenges that one faces in doing so. So he's a great addition to the team. And myself, I'm a physicist by training. I've a lot of experience in the corporate side of things, but recently shifted with no regrets to the startup space. Worked for a startup that is moving electricity around using AI. And of course, I worked at Strategy AI as director of research for 2.5 years. And that's it. So we're looking forward to hearing from Sarah at Alo Solutions. If she's there, I'll let you manage that, Valentine.
Yes, thank you. So thank you. I think we have together with Sarah a well-rounded table of experts, solution owners, legal expert, business strategy experts. So Mike is yours, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That's hard descriptions to follow. So my name is Sarah Sparks, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Alo Solutions. We are using technology to change child welfare in Canada. I'm just going to share my screen here. And just let me know if everyone can see that.
Yes. Perfect. Yep.
All right, so we are an inclusive next generation solution for better child welfare. So it took me personally about 4 years to come to the conclusion that I was ready to be a caregiver. And so when I had made the decision, I did so very excitedly and called into my local CAS, wanted to make an appointment, and got stood up. And it actually took me about 3 attempts to get somebody on the phone to even have a first discussion with. So the process to become a caregiver itself is very dated and ineffective. I felt obviously a lack of control without being able to speak with anyone. But then when I actually did and was able to speak with the social worker, I realized the immense caseload that she was under, and that she was feeling that lack of control as well. Also, during the time where I was doing my research, I was made painfully aware of the overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black children within the system. And those are two groups and communities that I myself belong to. So I absolutely felt a connection. 52.2% of the children in care in Canada are Indigenous, and yet only make up about 7.7% of the population. And we don't even have complete statistical information on Black children, African Canadian children, and youth in care Canada-wide. But we do know that there is about 41% of the children in care in Toronto are African Canadian, yet making up only about 8% of the population. So very sobering statistics. And that's where we come in. Alo is a SaaS-based system that automates that caregiver application process. We're a customizable solution designed by an Indigenous and African Canadian company that provides real-time updates and access to application status and personal information at all times. And our solution allows agencies to recruit more caregivers with a focus on overrepresented communities. It's statistically and also there's a lot of reports on the correlation between children who are able to stay within their own communities or have ties to community and the outcomes that happen later on. So we want to make sure that we're keeping as many kids immersed in their culture and keeping them understanding their sense of self. And if they are, at a point where they need to be with someone else who is not of the same culture, we want to make sure that we're still recruiting people who understand the importance of that, and we'll be helping them to, maintain some sort of normalcy. So one thing we're really excited about is that we provide race-based analytical information on the applicant pool. As we're going into our the development of our case management system, this is going to be built out a lot more poignantly. So, so social workers can make better caregiver decisions based on that race-based analytical information. The applicant dashboard keeps everyone, once again, up to date. Status updates, next steps, and feedback are all available in real time, and all documentation can be uploaded remotely. We're really excited as well, being compatible with the changing landscape of child welfare, including Bill C-92. And Bill C-92 is allowing First Nations, or giving First Nations their inherent right to regain control of their child welfare. And we're seeing this happen in July of 2021. A First Nations community in Saskatchewan signed an agreement with the federal government, and there are 38 agencies representing 100 nations in line for similar outcomes. We're also seeing reports such as the One Vision, One Voice report that's come out demanding systems exactly like Alo to track stats on African Canadian youth in care, including race-based analytics, and calling for transparency. So where does AI come into play? While speaking with social workers and supervisors, we realized a theme. Many said that going through apprehension reports, they could detect with incredible accuracy which reports belong to Black or Indigenous people simply by the language. This was not because the incidents or reaction to apprehension were different than those of non-minority homes. However, language for the minorities void of evidence was aggressive, belligerent, and angry. And those in non-minority homes were concerned, remorse, or upset. Those in non-minority homes were more likely to retain custody and receive in-home services, while minority homes in comparable situations would face apprehension. Alo wants to use AI to track conscious and unconscious bias in those reports and leverage race-based analytical data collected on the person or the social worker, as well as the agency, centric to those apprehension rates. So my question for you is, first of all, what type of AI should we be using and how can we do this?
Awesome. Sorry, I was still on mute. Thank you.
Me too.
Okay, so off we go. That was an excellent question and great presentation. So
absolutely. So I think you made a great suggestion in the chat, and I think we will start with Deepti, as she has a lot of NLP expertise. Deepti, are you there?
Do you want to explain what NLP is?
Yes. So, okay, NLP is basically, so machines, so when we have text, like in your case, we have languages and you want to detect bias in languages. Now, AI does not understand text. AI understands numbers. So what NLP can do is convert text into a numerical representation for the AI solution to process it and take decisions. So in your case, it will be using all the textual data that you collect, putting it into an AI model so that it can do the correlations, identify the biases, and do predictions, like tell you if there is a bias or not, what kind of bias is present, stuff like that. So that's where NLP comes in. I think your problem is directly an NLP problem.
Amazing. And in terms of us seeking out experts and so forth, who should it be that we're looking to speak with, or the agencies we should be looking to speak with?
So your objective of using AI is very clear. So I would start with thinking about data first. You need to have data samples that reflect the kind of biases you want to target. And so, yeah, I would start thinking about data collection at this point. So either collect data on your own, or maybe if there are third-party vendors in your domain who already have this kind of data, or if there are public repositories, like if at government level these kind of data sets are collected, I would start looking at that.
Okay, that's amazing. Yeah. Awesome.
Mike, can we get a perspective from you on that question?
And just so Sarah can relax, this is being recorded, Sarah, so I can send you the recording after. So you can just soak it in, listen, and focus on your next question. Don't have to take notes. I will send you the recording.
Perfect. I definitely wouldn't be able to remember all this, so that helps.
I'd have to overall, I agree with Deepti on kind of the approach, data first. And you said something in your presentation that stood out when you were talking about the bias in the language that that I think is your starting point, which was when you have somebody who's an expert look at the language, they can very clearly delineate that. So when you're looking at collecting your data, one component is going to be the actual language that is detected, but the other component is the what you call the annotation. So it's the identifying, is this language showing a bias, and then you know, any dimension that you will want to teach an AI to predict, that's what you're going to have to include in your annotation. So if you have certain words that you've seen linked to, say, a bias against Indigenous communities, then you'd want to highlight that in the kind of annotation. So your data set will be kind of a piece of text, and then the information that you would want to teach a model to predict.
Okay. So if I can just like ask a question to all three of you, so that, like, for example, I better understand. So let's say the bias is actually in the conversation. So the conversation, so Sarah what would she have to do to collect that data? She would record conversations. Therefore, like, legally speaking, she would have to have an agreement with CAS, you said, Sarah? That's the Child Services in Ontario, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it's going to be, we're pitching Canada-wide, so it's going to differ.
Oh, yeah. Then you're going to stumble into each different province is going to have different laws about like what agreement you can have if you were to record a conversation. So there's a bundle of legal implications there in terms of if you were. So are there other ways to all three of you that Sarah can collect useful data? Because basically she needs to teach the AI. So for example, if I have cancer detection, which is in computer image, I'm going to use 10,000 images of colon cancer until AI understands what colon cancer is, and then maybe, when it's well trained, detects it better than a human, for example. In bias in language, human language, and we were talking about conscious bias, unconscious bias, but basically the bias in the language. So we have data collection questions right now, how that would be done practically speaking. What I've seen some organizations do is create an app that is a chat that offers information, and therefore the language that they're collecting is through the chat information provider chat tool. I would think of Mielin, and I can put it in the Mielin, and I'll put the perfect link after that, but so that I remember. That's a little bit what they did. So I just wanted to send back the question to all three of you, Daniel, Deepti, and Michael, as to practically how how Sarah would have to go about that. Because imagine we're trying to write the grant application for her, right?
Deepti?
Yes, to know the ground truth, like the absolute truth, it has to be recording the conversation. We might want to inform them, like before recording, that this call is being recorded and monitored, like usually the way they do. That's like the best way to know the ground truth, according to me. I don't know much about the chat. The second way you suggested, I'm assuming this means like people express themselves through text. That's what it means, right?
Oh, are you asking me?
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Million Solutions. Is that the right?
No, I think she's asking Sarah what to say.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So the way that the system would work, the case management, when we build it out, they would be submitting reports within the Alo system based on what happened during that apprehension. So everything, they have to compile these reports and then send those over to supervisors. So we would receive all of that text information within our own system. So all of that would be recorded.
Okay, so I have a point to make. Yes, to know the absolute truth, recording the conversations, recording call is the best way. The reason why I do not support text over recording a call is because in text, a lot of emotions are missed out, but in a call, you can hear them clearly. So that is information. When you want to detect bias, because a simple sentence, I'm excited or I am excited, it can be said in several ways, which you can figure out when you record a call. So I would strongly suggest that if it is possible within the norms of legality, if it's possible to record calls and get the basic, like the truth, the ground truth, then that would be my suggestion to you. And I would also like to put one more point in the table, because you are talking about different groups here. You're talking about Indigenous people, then you're talking about other minorities too. When you collect data, you have to make sure that each of these groups are very well represented in your data set. So if Indigenous people, calls corresponding to Indigenous people are more, then they will be more in the data set. But you have to make sure that the other categories are also there in equal proportions.
Okay.
So that they're equally represented in the data set, and the bias is also very well predicted. Like it should not happen that bias in Indigenous gets predicted well, then the bias in other minorities, if the other minorities are not very well represented in the data set. So this is one thing that you might want to keep in mind when you collect this data.
You totally just answered another one of my questions, so that's perfect. It is very much where we don't want to be biased detecting bias. So we want to make sure that we're doing this properly.
Yeah, and the questions you're asking are the answers are not simple. They're very rich. Mike, did you want to add something to what Deepti said?
Nothing really springs to mind beyond what Deepti mentioned.
I had a question actually, and I'm going to back up a little bit. Hopefully I don't irritate anybody with this, but it's something that I like to do when I'm trying to understand a problem. And that is, maybe you could just spell out a little bit more about what it is and why you're doing it. So, so when you're saying that you're trying to look at the text and you're trying to look for bias, you know, maybe give us a concrete example of what you mean by bias, and then what you would do with that information, because that can have a strong implication on what, you know, how you attack certain problem. So that's my first question, and then my second question will be about data again, and how much data do you already have, and how much data do you think you can get? But maybe we could start with that first one. Back up a little bit and explain to us, Sarah, what is it? Give us a concrete example of the kind of biases you're targeting, and are you just looking for a sort of like, for instance, let's say we're looking for gender bias. So generally, there's two classes. You know, this thing is either geared towards, well, it gets more complicated, of course, with they, them, and everything. But let's say just keeping it simple, there's just a few classes when you're talking about gender. You know, you could have a lot more of that when you're talking. And cancer is another great example. Yeah, either cancer or it's not. But you could be looking for biases that have many classes or even a spectrum of bias. So and that changes the AI part quite a bit as well. So could you shed a little light on that, Sarah, for us?
So when we're looking at child welfare and in general, there is a lot of systemic issues that go back to residential schools. You know, there's a lot of systemic problems. So we're noticing that not just in the language, but even in apprehension rates and so forth, minorities are looked at as more aggressive or because there might be where they do things differently. There might be more of a community background to the way that they raise children, or you know, a grandparent who is very, very much in the picture if mom and dad are not able to be there. That we're seeing that there's bias when it comes to things not being a mom and a dad, and that's it. And it's just the kind of colonial way of looking at things. So I think for us, trying to track that bias is also people's inherent bias of thinking that, and not to be very blunt, but thinking that Black people are aggressive, or thinking that the Indian lady down the street who was upset that her kid fell off their bike and got mad at them because she told them, that's not her being aggressive towards her child, that's her disciplining her child. It's just those kind of systemic issues that are going on within social workers, as well as within.
Maybe I'm just trying to think of so I think the first question that Danielle asked was like, what specific use case would you like to tackle when you say you are addressing bias? One could be an emotion detection. So when we have like a conversation, we can detect if it's aggressive or neutral, or all the whole range of spectrum of emotions we have. We can detect what emotion is it conveying, keeping in mind the background of this person or the people in the conversation. So let's say even if somebody is using a bit of an aggressive tone, perhaps the actual emotion is care. The mother is caring for the kid, and that's why she's asking the kid to be cautious, but she's saying it in a bit of an aggressive tone. So the actual emotion is care over aggression or something else, or anger.
But if I can just answer Deepti questions, like, isn't that bias in itself? I spent 5 years in Japan. The tone of voice in Japan does never go up a single tone.
So that's why we need
I'm a kid beater, and I beat up my husband too. By the tone of my voice, I'm francophone. I have my hands up in the air all the time, and I'm like, blah, 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 right? So
Yeah.
I mean, I would be deemed very aggressive by the system. I mean, just my tone right now is
So-
probably too much,
so-
right? So,
Yeah, so maybe your background, maybe the tone of your voice, maybe the text, what you are saying, maybe the person you are talking to, all of this cumulatively would put this particular conversation in maybe like in a more caring category than in aggression. So it's not just what the person is saying, but it's also the background, the tone, and that's why I suggested we use audio data. If we could collect audio over text, because tone is very well reflected in audio data. So tone, the context, the people involved in the conversation, the backgrounds they're all coming from, that cumulatively, collectively tells us what kind of emotion is being conveyed by this conversation.
And then if we were looking at
I mean,
something
this is
like,
just one use case. We can, of course, deep dive into it, or you can change the problem. But I'm just thinking of a specific problem which AI can tackle, and this can become like an emotion detection classification problem.
so if we were able to look at, let's say, two different sets of reports, one's of a minority report and one of a non-minority report, the apprehension or the event is very much the same. But then we're looking at the way that things were recorded for one person as different to another. Would we be able to kind of use AI to detect that even though these events were similar, even though the outcomes were similar, if the child was apprehended or not, or the reason that they were being investigated was the same, but the Black child, the mother was seen as aggressive and the child was apprehended, and the non-Black child was given services within the home. Is there a way for us to take those two texts and use AI to detect, if that person has been wrongfully?
Yes, there's a way, and that's where we go back to the point of annotation that was just made. Michael made that point. So if that information is there in the data, you can do it. As long as those specific cases are present in the data sets, as long as they are very well annotated, the model can learn. The model only learns what you provide it as input. The model will not create anything new or generate something. It will only try to learn the different patterns that exist in the input that you give to the model. And based on that, it'll help you to make predictions. But again, we have to make sure that the different cases, like the indigenous, minority, and all the different categories you have, they're very well represented in the input data set for the model to clearly understand it. Otherwise, the less represented cases will be just lost. And the model will just like, it'll like memorize the good represented cases.
And if I can add on the case that you described, right, where you have ostensibly two similar by the facts cases, but based on the way that the case is reported in the different language, there's bias. You could likely, without too much trouble, collect the annotation required to build an AI that would tell you there is a risk of bias here. But going the last mile to say this case was mistreated, there you would have to have enough examples where you actually closed the loop and proved in this case it was identical, but there is a bias here that resulted in. So there's an additional layer at the end if you want to go all the way and be prescriptive about saying, this is a case, this is a problematic case, versus saying here there is a risk of bias detected in the language. It's just kind of earlier on in the spectrum, right? If you went to see how much of a human there is in the loop, right? The decision there is to say, okay, there's a risk here. Let's look deeper into this case and try to see if we can find out. Versus if it's fully automated, the degree of certainty needed there and the degree of risk that you're adding on top of it, because there is so much subjectivity, it could be dangerous.
And I think the way that we're looking at it right now, while it's in its infancy, is being able to track that information to see if there's maybe conscious or unconscious bias on the part of that individual social worker. And then seeing if we need to look into retraining or see if there's some sensitivity, something that needs to be addressed there, and then be able to use that information to see what their apprehension rates are based
So this is really interesting, Sarah, and I want to make sure I understand because, you know, depending on your answer, it's a very exciting point. So it comes back to the reason why you're doing this. So are you trying to use AI here? I mean, AI is used for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the number one reason is that, you know, it's just overwhelming. And so people don't have enough bandwidth to read all these reports. And you want to streamline that process and basically automate what a human would be doing. That's one example. But it sounds to me like you're trying to do something a little bit more, but I could be wrong. So it sounds to me like what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, hey, you're trying to remove bias that a social worker might have because of cultural differences and the kinds of things that you pointed to. And so is that right? You're actually using AI here to address bias rather than to sort of say, you know, like the kind of gender biases that we often have in society and that happens in our models. So you're actually using it to solve a bias problem, a human bias problem. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And honestly, both to detect it and both to address it.
And okay. And I guess the other thing that I always like to do and I always like to ask with is, can a human solve this problem? So I get it that some of the social workers might be biased and it's not even their own fault. It has to do with cultural background, but can you have a human do this? Because it's really hard I always approach AI problems differently when I know that humans can't do it. So there are problems and there can be different reasons. Sometimes a human can't do it just because it's just too much information.
Yeah.
But sometimes a human can't do it. So for instance, you know, we've had, and I'm sure Mike can list off, we've talked to clients who want to do stuff with AI, but when we try to find out what they're doing, there's no way a human can even do this. And so, and it has just to do with the amount of data that's there or the type of data. I mean, AI is going to be trained by a human. That's why we keep talking about annotation. So if a human can't do it and you can't have your panel of annotators remove that bias, then you already have a big problem there. And so that's important to acknowledge.
If I can also bring the question to like what kind of market there is out there, because you are a business. So maybe Michael, you want to, or Daniel, you want to put like your more business head on. And I'm thinking that Alo Solution could be a impact assessment tool that uses AI and is a government service provider. Because right now the client that I'm hearing is governmental child services. Is that correct? Could that be, I mean, you're addressing the bias in their system, but you can offer that as a service.
Yeah, so we're dealing with government, we're dealing with private, we're even dealing with you know, respite care. We were also looking into elder care, just to use this to understand, you know, the landscape. Unfortunately,
and is it more of a research project, or do you have like a client in mind who would buy this?
So it would be definitely geared to the child welfare system, either public or private. Our first tool is an automation tool to automate the application process. So I'm really excited at the fact that, you know, we're very aware that human emotion and connection need to be very present within decision making. And so we want to utilize the AI to give an accurate or a really good picture as to what's going on, so that a real person can go in and say, okay, you know, we've got a couple of people here that seem to apprehend too many kids from this side when they don't need to. Maybe we need to put training in place. Maybe that's where we put the next chunk of money to make things better. Or, you know what, we don't have caregivers in the Lebanese community. Let's find a way for us to used funds that we have in a way that we would be able to target those segments.
Okay.
So that children that are apprehended are given the best possible homes that they could find.
But do you need AI for that? Because you'll know people's backgrounds, right?
Yes, but the amount of data that's there for one person, like you were saying, it's insane.
Okay.
So for us to be able
That's
to
what I like to hear. I love to hear problems of too much data. That's a quality problem. That's a quality problem.
That's not a problem. That's a good thing.
That's a good
So
thing.
it's definitely utilizing AI to look at the landscape of this humongous amount of information and having real people figure out a way to take that information from the AI and allocate services the way that they should.
And the information that you have now, so beyond collecting new data, you already have a lot of data. And that data that you have right now, are they written reports, typed, handwritten? What are they exactly?
So once once Alo is live, because we are still, we've customers waiting for us, but we're pre-revenue. Once we have that information, and we are also CPIN compatible, and CPIN is the IBM Current system that Ontario is using to connect all child welfare agencies, we would be able to utilize that crazy amount of data to kind of understand what the landscape is.
Okay, I'm a numbers guy. I want to know how much data.
I'm not even sure, to be honest with you, but it's probably.
I know we don't want to compromise her business model.
No,
And sell all her secrets here.
Lots and lots. Let's just say that.
Michael, did you want to add something, like from business wise, in terms of, because you've been in that process, with government? Are there any particular things that aspects that she should be mindful about when thinking of providing a service to AI services to the government, for example?
I mean, it's good that you have the data. Let's start with that. Based on solely on my experience, it's been a little bit tricky, but that's always kind of that's where the initial conversation always starts. That's kind of why Daniel also raised the question there. From a business perspective, I mean, there's one thing is having the data, but then it's also, if you know you're planning on using it for instance, classifying information. Right, or classifying the sentiment of the text, or identifying if there's a bias in a piece of text, then I would recommend, even before so you have it, it's stored somewhere, but it's likely it will need to be transformed and prepared in a more optimal way to train models. For instance, I know that in text classification, in general, you're going to get something that's probably performs better on a small chunk of text than on 2 pages. So, and this is just for the sake of example. So what I would recommend is, even if you're not ready to build the AI, even if you're in the data preparation step, to work with somebody who knows what works and what doesn't, so that they can advise you on the transformation or the data prep that would be required. Additionally, I think on the annotation piece, especially in this case, right, and I think Daniel mentioned an annotation panel, but that might not immediately jump to mind, right, what that necessarily means, but it's to ensure kind of the quality and actually ensure you're not adding a layer of bias on the annotation. Because that's what you're teaching the model ultimately. So if you've only got one person, or you have 2 people, but they have a different caseload, and they don't see eye to eye, then your model is going to internalize that bias, and then has a snowball effect, actually. So what we've done in the past, and Daniel and I worked on this project together, but you have you have multiple people, it's more costly in terms of effort up front, but you have a group of folks all annotating the same data. And then at the end, you have to actually compare, and where there are discrepancies, they actually have to be sort of worked through to establish that there is only kind of one baseline at the end.
Okay.
Which is more investment, but absolutely, I think in this kind of case would be critical.
And that brings me to another great question. As Alo goes into funding, and we're actually crowdfunding through Equivesto in order to allow our communities to be a part of Alo, and we're trying to keep some of our, to build wealth within these communities, and the communities that we're in usually not privy to investing, give them an ability to do that. What are we looking at to implement something like this, cost-wise? I love the
because we're talking quality data annotation costs.
Yeah.
So yeah, do you have a quick round number?
And I say that as someone who is really trying to has been trying to understand the costs, and yeah, they've been elusive.
I think we can talk a little bit. I think, you know, the devil's in the details, and so there's always kinds of things that require more more double clicking and deeper dives than we can do in an hour here. I don't know, Deepti, do you have a
So yeah, so annotation, I see it like this. So sometimes it's easy to annotate, like if you have a picture and if you have to identify a cat or make a box around a cat, it's pretty easy. Annotators can do that themselves independently without taking much help from the client. But in your case, they would need a bit of a collaboration from you to teach them how to identify what you're looking for. So I would recommend to contact 2-3 groups and get some quotes and compare, and maybe you can bargain a bit.
Well, just like what's the annual salary of a data annotator with no specific domain expertise? Because I know some lawyers can do very high level,
it depends on which
annotation.
country. It depends on the country where the annotators are coming from. Like in India, it's very cheap, I know, because we don't have any, income laws or labor laws. So it's very cheap. But if you have, for example, Izahit, if you hire annotators from them, I think they would have standard hourly salaries. I don't know, 15 euros, or I don't know, something like that. So, but in India, it would be cheaper. But then these people, they work under a lot of pressure. So I'm not so sure if these people should be employed to do an annotation of a sensitive data like that.
That's another ethics problem. I'm not sure you want to hire those.
What I found interesting though is that we right away gravitated to the cost around the data, and not the which I think is right. Unless someone disagrees with me, but the AI, I guess the AI can be very scary for a lot of people. And so they tend, especially when we have domain experts who come to us and say, you know, how much does the AI cost? How much is the AI going to cost? We usually right away guide them and start talking about the data cost. So it's the answer that the sort of the reaction that Valentine and Deepti just had is interesting. Right away, we talked about general costs because Sarah's question was very general. We right away gravitated onto the cost of annotating the data and managing that data. But there is the AI cost as well. Yeah.
Well, my advice for the AI cost is I always build a partnership with a research institute. So go to Ryerson X, for example, go to Waterloo, go to any university that you have a good relationship with, and create a partnership. So you'll have students working on that with you. And that's why I was saying, do you want to, it can be part AI deployment project, part of Alo Solutions. You can have a business model behind that. But you might also want to develop like AI research partnership with academia. So it reduces your cost and ensures that you have a multidisciplinary team looking at the ethical implications. and that you can put the money into the data and quality data annotation that's done by the community. You can have workshops where you train the community to annotate the data, and you're keeping the value and you're offering digital literacy skills at the same time. That's a little bit of Isa It, which was our partner last year. That's their business model. They work in the global South, the women they hire, but they offer digital literacy skills at the same time, as well as a decent salary and decent working conditions to help them, those women, go into STEM and digital professions. So they're elevating those women's understanding of digital systems while while annotating. They're based in France, so they have clients like Dior, and they have a lot of fashion clients. So they're still annotating the data. They're getting the job that they need to be done, but they're what you would call a corporate social responsibility data annotating project. You could do the same thing in your community and in different communities across Canada. Actually, it'd be a very interesting project to put.
Yeah, and do you suggest that, Valentine, because Alo Solutions is a nonprofit? In other words, they'll have more success pulling those strings than, let's say, the firm where I work now, which is, for profit. And so if I go and approach, Ryerson and say, hey, listen, we have lots of, PhD time to go and come and build our engines, they're going to say, well, what's in it for us?
We actually are a for-profit.
Oh,
we actually are
sorry.
a for-profit company.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm the one who thought you were a nonprofit.
We are a socially responsible for-profit company.
Okay.
So the only thing there then is, one of the things, of course, is that you do enter into some discussions around ownership. Universities can be a great source, and they're going to love the cause, even though it's for profit. They're going to love the cause, and I think that.
But they're going to keep the IP.
But that's the thing. What are they going to want to do? They might want to. It depends. They might not want the IP, but they'll want to publish a lot around it. We've had that where we've cooperated with universities, and they're all gung ho because it's fantastic use cases for their students to learn and all that stuff. But then they want to publish all the results, and then it's kind of out there in the open. So, including maybe certain trade secrets that Alo Solutions wants to keep. So you'd have to think about how to cut that up. Protect the things that you think are your secret sauce that could, because of course, one of the things that could be scary for you. I mean, I think that you're and maybe that's why Valentine just assumed you're a nonprofit, is that your mission is very altruistic, and so you probably don't mind so much if there's another Alo Solutions that opens in Europe that's going to just copycat everything that you're doing to address the same problem over there, let's say. But those are preferences and questions that you have to ask yourself, and who you use for doing your implementation.
If I just point to the for-profit, nonprofit, sorry, we're husband and wife. We're used to interrupting each other all the time. Sorry, Daniel. He can ramble off sometimes, sorry. Daniel's giving really great advice, by the way, but I just wanted to point out to the fact that one of the startups that we have speaking tomorrow morning, Whale Seeker, is a for-profit organization that is B Corp. So you can, if you have been in existence for 2 years and you want to be a social responsible, recognized as such, and get the trust that goes with that, BDC does give that certification for any business who's been operating for more than 2 years. So if you are for profit, I would highly suggest getting your B Corp certification. And as Daniel mentioned, when you develop partnerships with academia, I would think a lot, like Facebook has huge partnerships with MILA, Quebec AI Research Institute. So it's not because you're for profit that you can't get what they're going to want in terms of partnership out of you. It's really going to be a give and take relationship. You're B Corp, they get more research, they can publish the research, you can keep your secret sauce. I mean, those are all you're going to need a lawyer on the team to look at all those details, and every university is different. Some universities are very aggressive about keeping the intellectual property if they support your project, or very often it'll be shared 3 ways, depending on who's the partnering organizations. So those are, those are in the contract that you.
Yeah, and I'm going to qualify something I said before I get some feedback from Deepti and Mike on this, and that is that very often, more often than not, when you start to take a hard look at what you have and what you're building, the secret sauce will be the data, the annotations, all that stuff. And that stuff is what you have to protect. The AI, majority of what you'll be able to do, there's a lot of, and that's what a company like Strategy brings to the table, which is the deployment, which is hard and much harder than you would imagine. But the AI itself is largely open source. There's not much secret sauce in the AI anymore, because unless you're doing something really off the wall that will have proprietary AI, which doesn't sound like that's the case for you, then a lot of that AI, you can go and, a data scientist, someone, well endowed with skills like Deepti can go, and I bet you she can do the AI and get the right models going relatively quickly, all with open source, not costing you a cent, other than her time to just go and download that stuff and get it going. What's really hard then is to plug it into the rest of your machine and deploy it and have it run regularly and all that kind of stuff, and getting your data, all that deployment piece is really hard. And the whole world, miscalculated how hard that deployment piece is. But is that the secret sauce? It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Deepti, Mike, did you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, Michael was going to say something.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please go ahead.
I was going to echo what Daniel said, where it's kind of the, when you're looking at sort of an AI solution, there's the 3 pillars. There's the AI itself that kind of crunches the data. There's the data, and then there's the approach. And the approach is what can be new or established, right? While what comes out of it in terms of a prediction with your data may be new, I don't think the approach is, right? It's something that is established. It's something it's not a net new problem. So it's something that you should be able to, even the deployment piece, which Daniel brings up, which is more kind of a challenging piece and it's more manageable. Since you're a SaaS platform, I assume you're working with software engineers anyway. So a little bit of that, like they can be, right, they can be leveraged, or they can work on that piece as well, but it requires education, probably a little bit of extra expertise. But I guess the secret sauce is usually the combination of the data and the approach, because it's just how you solve or come at the problem. And then, and tying back into, I think Valentine mentioned, right, if there was a kind of a theoretical copycat organization in Europe, I think that the biases found in the language will very likely be regional. So they wouldn't even be able to, they would have to, again, go through the whole process of data annotating. So there's an implicit kind of moat when you build something like this, especially around the data. So I'd echo, that's what you kind of want to protect, the data and the process.
Okay.
Deepti, did you want to add something? And then I'll wrap up with a little security note.
I was just wondering about data annotation. So the CCTTs, like Sidrin or Jacob, when they take up projects, they engage CJEP students to do data annotation because they want to bring those students in the AI process. So maybe that could be an option for her when it comes to annotation. And because they're exclusively eligible for certain grants, data annotation is included in the budget. So it's not that something extra is going on from the client's end. Once the grant is approved, then data annotation is a part of the budgets, and they will hire students from CCTT to do this kind of stuff. So that could be one option for her. like in terms of annotating the data. And you can also work with the students, like one domain expert from your end can interact with the students and teach them how to annotate the data. But before that, I would also suggest you to identify that one specific use case. When you say you want to detect bias, it can mean several things. You have to identify what specifically you want to detect, because annotation depends on that, and the model performance, modeling, everything depends on that. So identify that one specific use case so that once and for all it gets annotated, and then you can start AI part. And I agree with Daniel. AI implementation is not difficult. Most of it is open source. It is the deployment part that's tricky. I would also suggest one more thing that's called hybrid models. So bringing human in the loop. That means once the AI model has done the predictions, then one of the domain experts from your end can check if those predictions are making sense or not and correct the bias. So that way you'll be able to correct model bias. So there's
Thank you,
there's bias
Deepti.
coming from the model too. So there's data bias, but then there is model bias too. So you need to correct that. So whenever an AI system is put in place, initially it is always recommended to put human in the loop so that they can correct the, the rare, difficult cases, and so that the model can correct itself. So it's like humans helping the model correct itself, that kind of system. So.
And that's your natural language processing expert. Thank you, Deepti. I want to finish on one last note. There have been more and more reports of security risks, of foreign interests, being very interested in that know-how that Michael was talking about in younger startups' applications of AI. We tend to be naive a little bit in Canada, and security is not something to be neglected, especially if you're working with the kind of data of vulnerable populations. So from a legal perspective, you're dealing with vulnerable populations, therefore your data security budget, we talk a lot about annotation, will have to be extremely well detailed and a very, very important factor to take into consideration. So I just wanted to wrap up with that and thank you, Daniel, Deepti, Michael, for your advice. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your domain expertise and that project that we hope to see move forward. We'll be in touch, Sarah, again, of course. And, depending on what you decide to choose, we've had other conversations before. We've talked about different AI applications. And, I think it's about refining the first, what they call minimum viable product. Is it like a research association with academia that you want to start with to really help you pinpoint? Or do you want to apply, right away for a smaller solution data collect? So it's going to be around identifying that moving forward. And but
Valentine?
Yeah.
I see that we got a sort of just a pat on the back from Lena from Factually Health, which is another startup that you and I are both familiar with. I just wanted to, we have a few minutes left. Was there any other startups who had any questions?
No questions, Danielle. It's just a terrific exchange, because it's so much along the lines of what we're doing in our company, Sarah, and the data collection. In our case, we're looking at misinformation on various diseases, and the data collection is really extensive. And that's where most of our energy is going to, and that human in the loop, that hybrid model you were talking about. So what you're dealing with is quite similar to what we're doing, and the whole exchange has been extremely valuable. So thanks very much. That's all I have to say. Bye.
Thanks, Lena. Bye.
Okay, well, that was awesome. So I'm going to thank everyone. I'm going to let everybody if they need to, and just a huge thank you to everybody. And now we're going to take a short break. The next panel, actually, Sarah, if you want to stay on the line, is our professor, assistant professor, PhD students, and a master's student who have submitted to AI Social Mission our call for proposal 2 papers that go from data to information retrieval systems, which is a kind of a type of AI. and how they address bias in those two models. So I would definitely stay if you can, Sarah, to listen to the next presentation, which starts in 5 minutes at 3:50. And I see that Shirin is there, Amin is there, and the others will probably be joining soon, or either that I'm just not seeing them on the screen right now.
Thank you so much, everyone. Your advice and just this exchange has been just amazing, and it's really got my wheels turning. So I just really appreciate it. It's been great.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for your time, Deepti, Mike.
Thanks for having me. It's been
Thanks, everyone.
a great conversation. Take care.
Ciao.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks for the
Thank you.
opportunity. Bye.
Bye.